Schuckit, who's a professor in the Department of Psychiatry. And I cannot think of a person who thinks more differently than I do.
And that's why we had great conversations.
That's exactly my next statement. Yeah. We had some of the greatest collaborations. Actually, the first time I met with Dr. Schuckit, I was a postdoc with Karen Britton, and I had just started to work with Arnold Mandel. And I had developed this funky little task on the computer. And at that time, that meant you had to actually take a tray, put the desktop on the tray, and then roll the desktop between offices. So one day, I came to Dr. Schuckit's office and showed him my task, and he was saying, "Okay, that's but what is the question? What are you trying to answer? What's your hypothesis? And have you thought about this?" And in a matter of 5 minutes, I realized that I hadn't really thought through 80% of what I was going to study. Well, that sort of set me back about 5 years. And then at the second time, we sort of finally...
Which was 5 years later. Yeah, for very good reason. No, it wasn't. It wasn't, yeah.
But so then we started working together on some imaging projects. And I have to say, everything I know about how to do clinical research, I've learned from Dr. Schuckit. In my mind, there's nobody who does it more thoughtfully, more logically, more focused than you do. Really, I mean, there isn't. And I've sent people, and at the same time, I know that that you could be very tough on people and challenge people. And I've sent many of my postdocs your way because I think sometimes they do need that. Mm-hmm. They do need you need to be shaken up and really be told, okay, think about this, think about this, think about this. And that continued with me. And I never forget there was a lecture that I was supposed to be a talk I was supposed to be giving at ACNP, and it was about some of the data that we had just published, and I presented the slides to Dr. Schuckit, and he went through it with me and basically rearranged everything and basically said this is how. And I gave this talk, and the talk was a complete success. And somebody came up to me after the talk and said, "Did Marc Schuckit go with you?"
Thank you.
And
that's so neat.
And I have to say, and it was better. There was no question it was better. And I still. So whenever I go through somebody's talks and it sort of actually brings two things together. Any of you have seen the movie Amadeus? There's a line in Amadeus that where his main opponent, and I forget his name. Salieri. Criticizes Mozart for having too many notes. So he basically says that like just too many notes. Yeah. And so I always think about this because whenever I have a slide and I show a slide, I think about too many words.
Yes.
And so there are all these little pearls that I've learned over the years, and I'm so glad that you can now give this to basically give some of these instructions to the people here. Because if you take by heart what Dr. Schuckit is telling you, your talk will be better. There's no question about it.
Thank you. I want you to introduce me always. I'm going to bring you to any meeting I go to at my expense. How many of you saw, thank you very much, really lovely. How many of you saw my talk this morning? And I have a photographic memory. If you weren't there, I want to know. What I demonstrated this morning was how to take a very boring, very complex topic that involves politics and science and personality and philosophy, and put it together in a way that hopefully was aimed at a specific audience and was understandable, with hopefully people walking out of the meeting remembering, as we did briefly at the beginning when I walked in, remembering some of the main points. And the way that I did that is I learned by trial and error, and I had some awesome people teaching me and treating me as well, teaching me very early in my career. And it all really boils down to several things that are going to come up in this really brief talk. Thing number one, when you give a talk or write a paper, or write a grant. In other words, when you try to tell a story, you are unimportant. The reader of the paper, the judger of your grant, and the audience are important. You already know the material. You want to take the material that you have and put it in a way that keeps their attention, and that teaches them what you want to teach them. And this morning was a bit of a challenge because the topic DSM-5 I don't find particularly interesting. But there is a story to be told there. So what I'm going to talk about today was originally entitled How to Give a Lecture, but actually it's how to tell a story, and it is as important for grant applications, especially now that they're 12 pages, as it is for choosing a journal and structuring your article, and especially, God help you, the abstract, the most important thing about the article, structuring that for the audience you think will be reading it, and of course also for giving a lecture. So basically, among the punchlines is that everyone can give a lecture. Some people are going to be more comfortable doing it, but unless you have horrible social phobia, we all have some level of social phobia, especially when it comes to delivering a lecture, but unless you have a horrible social phobia, you are capable of doing the grand rounds or the application for a grant or the paper or delivering the lecture itself. I'm going to give you a style that I've found useful in trying to give a lecture and to write grants and write papers. And then you're going to take what I say, if what I'm saying is of any use to you, and you're going to modify it for yourself. So with that in mind, what will I cover? I'm going to cover philosophy. By the way, philosophy was probably the only course in college I didn't like. It seemed to be too many words. But nonetheless, philosophy in a pragmatic way, it has everything to do with how you do your work and how you tell your story. And then I'll talk a bit about preparation. I'll talk about slides, which are often ways to focus people's attention. And I'll talk a little bit about delivery and several other issues. We'll probably take about 40 minutes, and I would be very happy to have you interrupt me along the way if you have any questions. If I'm thinking about a thought or in the middle of an idea, I'll ask you to hold off for just a second. But as things develop, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask me. So as with my talk this morning about DSM, and for DSM, what happened with the Substance Use Disorders Committee, if you knew the philosophy of the people that were on the committee, and if you knew the philosophy of what the DSMs are supposed to do, you would have been able to predict almost everything we did. That our philosophy and the background behind our philosophy and the way that we then took that and put it into preparation was everything for how the DSM turned out, at least for our section of the DSM. So let's start with philosophy and preparation, probably the two most important things I'm going to share with you today. So we'll deal first with a point you might disagree with, but I'm fairly sure it's one of the reasons why, if I've written a good grant, written a successful paper, or delivered a decent lecture, I followed this rule, and I don't see how I could not. If the audience is expected to remember what you say, well, why the heck are you talking if they're not expected to remember what you say? And if indeed people's ability to hear things and to remember them is limited, how could you not limit the number of points you want to make? And probably, by the way, regarding telling your story in a K award, probably the most common reason why a K award is turned down is that you propose to do too much. You can always do more than you say, but you've got to be able to have the reader understand what you want to do and say, oh, I think with this person's background, they're capable of it. So again, for a K award or for a paper, my papers, I've been accused sometimes of, gee, you could have put those two papers into one. And my response is, and not have the audience understand it. The only way somebody is going to read that abstract of the paper and walk away with the ideas I'm trying to give is by limiting the number of major points I'm making. So for a lecture, you set about 4 clear goals. You tell them what you're going to say about those goals. You then say it about the goals, and then you remind them at the end what it is that you said. And that way, through saying them clearly and having a limited number of things, a large proportion of the audience will walk out in the lecture understanding what you're saying, and most people who read the paper will understand what it is that you're saying. So setting a clear, limited number of goals is incredibly important. Coming to a brief aside, I said that this would work for a lecture. Do you realize, and I'm sure you do, that scientific papers, telling your story through a scientific paper, it's the same process. You tell people in the introduction why what you want to share with them is important. Then you tell them how you studied what it was you told them was important. Then you show them the results of what you said was going to be important. And then you rub their noses in it in the discussion, telling them what you told them and convincing them that it's important, and then admitting, well, there were some things that we weren't able to actually do. Your last paragraph, which is caveats. Telling your story is pretty much the same, no matter which medium we're going to be talking about. And in all of them, set a limited number of goals. The second important thing in telling your story is that it has to fit your audience. You have to speak indeed in their language, and you have to meet their needs. So I could take the most complicated research project I've ever done. Probably it's the fMRI project that Martin and I did together with Susan Taper. And I should be able to take that information and lecture about it to 10th grade students. Then I should be able to take the same information with pretty much similar points and then take it and put in the slides and the information on the level of a postdoc or in a job talk. That I just take the idea, limited numbers, and I say, and who's that audience? Who's likely to be reading this journal? Who are the people who will read this journal who I think may be judging my grants in the future? And who's in the audience? And I have to make the material appropriate for the audience. So this morning, DSM-5, mostly residents and medical students. How do I make it alive for them and have them walk out with the major points I want to make? And when I would give a similar lecture to the Research Society on Alcoholism, where I've got people who are pro and con on a bunch of the issues, the same basic messages were there. What I expanded on, what my slide showed, varied a little bit. I have an organization that I run called the Alcohol Medical Scholars Group. And in the Alcohol Medical Scholars Group, I train people on what we're talking about now, but they work with me, I should say, for 3 days, twice a year, to try and learn and apply this material. And I give them an exercise. They develop a lecture on an alcohol or drug-related topic that they're going to deliver to first-year medical students. I keep reminding them, first-year medical students, and they have to develop the lecture based on that audience, which means no jargon. It means things that are important to you in your career, they don't know anything about yet, or maybe 10% of the audience knows it and the rest of them don't. Then after they've developed their lecture and delivered it, I'll tell them the night before they're going to give a second lecture, and I'm going to say, now you take that 40-minute lecture for first-year medical students, and I want you to now take that lecture, modify it into a 10-minute lecture that's going to be given to first responders on the police and on the fire squad, if it happens to be something related to them. And it's really quite possible to do. So setting clear goals, making sure that those goals are appropriate for the audience are essential. And then the next major point regarding philosophy is, how long is the average person's attention span listening to somebody talk? It's, I will guess, somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. Now, that's complicated enough. That means that your major points have to be made that you're hitting time when they're hearing you. And that they probably have 10 or 15 minutes, and then their minds go off on their laundry list and the argument they had with their spouse that morning and how the traffic's going to be on the way home. And you kind of give them little rests there, and then you go back to your major points. That's tough, but your 15 minutes are different than your 15 minutes. So regularly throughout my talk today, you'll be thinking of other things, and you'll each be taking your time away at a separate point, and I can't tell when those points are. So I tell you what I'm going to tell you. I then tell it to you, and I summarize it again. And when I summarize it, as I move from philosophy to, let's say, slides, as I move from one to another, I summarize it and then tell you I'm moving on. I've got now a few minutes where I have synchronized all of your attention. So, philosophy, set 4 clear goals, then be sure that the goals that you have and the way that you present them meet the needs of a particular audience and are appropriate for them. And remember that you're not going to be able to give a straight-on recitation for a 40-minute lecture, even a 20-minute lecture when you're presenting at a meeting. You're going to have key people in the audience off on tangents, and they're not listening to what you're saying. One of the things that I can guarantee you will get them off on tangents is if I don't do what I've done here. The titles are all capitalized. They all have capital letters. If I showed you a slide that didn't have that, you'll pause for a second and you'll say, there's something wrong with that slide. What's wrong? I really can't quite place it. Oh yes! He's only capitalized the first letter, and I lost you until you resynchronize to what's going on in the audience. Notice also, you can drift off, and the slides are so simple, so easy to understand, that you can drift off, come back and say, well, okay, well that's, and I've done that too. Yeah, okay, oh, there he is, he's still on philosophy, and I was off on a tangent. This is all business. The business is, I have a story to tell. How do I get it across to the majority of people, or the largest number of people in the audience, in a way that is most appropriate? Now, in addition to the philosophy, probably the second philosophy is, I think, the most important thing I've shared with you. The second is preparation. It really turns out that, to me anyway, you need to get to a point, for most lectures, you need to get to a point where the worst thing that could happen to you after the work that you put in is somebody says, I'm sorry, you can't give that lecture. And even if you hate lecturing, you then say, I know this stuff so well. If you're well prepared, what's going to happen, even when it comes time to, where one is defending a thesis, is with very few exceptions, you know 10 times as much about your topic than most of the other people in the audience. Or else they wouldn't be the audience. They are there indeed to learn from you. So it is important that one be extremely well prepared. And how does one do that? How does one learn the material well? Well, for me, and Martin was talking about this earlier, for me, everything is logical regarding writing papers, doing a research project, writing a grant, or delivering a lecture. And it's got to be logical, or else you can't follow me. It can't be chaotic. I can't go A, B, D, C. It's got to be a flow of logic. And then you can go off, drift off, and you can pick me up again. So, and for a grant application, it's essential, because they've got 20 grants in front of them when they're reviewing, and they have to follow what you're doing well enough to say, boy, this guy's really good. And what he's really saying is, this guy or woman is really good because I feel smart. I followed that. I followed that very clearly. And it's how people think. People think by branching logic. And I do that clear development of logic, I do that through an outline. And the outline form is really essential for things that I reviewed this morning in order to give this talk. And for any talk that I give, or for any paper that I write. Then once I think I've developed an outline, I revise it and practice it, revise it and practice it. And when I'm giving a talk or reading through a grant, I'm basically scanning through, is that logical? Did I go from A to B to C logically, so that someone in the audience can follow what I want to say? And if I didn't, if I skipped a step, that there should be another step in there, great, now I spot it because I've practiced it, I've talked aloud to basically a mirror or within my office, and I practice until I'm sure, as best I can, that the logic is making sense. And in part of the logic, I've got to think through, for this audience, or these readers of grants or readers of my paper, what is it that might cause them trouble? And how can I head off that trouble so it doesn't stop them in their tracks and give me a lower score on my grant or have people tune out to my lecture. So the preparation and philosophy are everything. And I get to this outline through a focused literature review. So a brief aside. In my lecture this morning, my goal was to have people walk out saying, oh, they did this fairly well, they took it fairly seriously, and they really seemed to know what they were doing, and there were trade-offs, but they did a pretty good job. I don't agree with everything, but they did a pretty good job. And they don't want me this morning to review everything that there could be about the DSMs, the prior DSMs. So if I were doing a literature search for this morning's talk, I would not be focusing so much on history in detail. I would be focusing on who the people were and what their philosophy was and how that predicted what the outcomes were going to be. So the literature review that I do and that I suggest you do for any of the time you want to tell your story often begins, especially if I'm into an area I don't know much about, with a recent paper. And in that recent paper, it'd be wonderful if it was a review. But if it's not a review paper on the topic that I want to do, then if it's not a review paper, at least something recent that seems to have a decent introduction and discussion, because that's where I'm going to get everything. For most talks I give, including a scientific talk, I don't talk about the methods other people use. And for medical students, you never talk about methods, because they don't care about methods, they care about the punchline. Unless they're in a special class about something. So I begin with a recent paper, and then from that recent paper, I say to myself, who is the audience? And I'm starting now to take my notes. And this is the way David Siegel used to be. He was one of my best friends and used to be in this department. This is the way David Siegel taught me to do it, and you may know how to do it. You may have used this method forever. What I'll do is I'll take the first paper I see, make sure, is this going to be appropriate for the topic? Do I think that it's going to be appropriate for this audience? And then I start skimming it. I skim the abstract, which tells me, is it in my ballpark or not? It might give me some useful information. Then I skim the introduction. And as I'm starting to do this, I'm making a list of potential topics that are going to be part of my outline, potentially. So let's say I'm giving a lecture on the genetics of alcoholism, which is my major area of research, and we're going to say I'm going to give that, something I did just, in fact, do, look at risk factors for alcohol and drug dependence for a first or second year medical school class. And in this article, I happen to be picking up a wonderful review article recently done by Marianne Enoch. And as I pick that paper up, I look at, in the introduction, she says something about epidemiology, the rates of the various disorders, and I say, is that important? Might be part of my introduction. So for me, I do this on sheets of paper. I take a blank sheet of paper and write across the top epidemiology. And then Marianne told me something about epidemiology. It's not her major focus, but she cites Bridget Grant, 2007. And so I say, I put down where I got this from, which is Enoch 2013. And then I write underneath that, cites Grant et al. 2007. And then I write down specifically what was said. Now, a brief aside. If I use it in the paper or lecture, I really should go back and look at the original article. And I usually do. Meaning sometimes I'm in a rush and I knew the material and I don't go back and see the original article, and shame on me, but sometimes there's not enough time for it. And then I skim down further and she says something about the proportion of the variance or risk explained by genes for dependence on each of the drugs. I say, do I really want to, do I have to talk separately about use factors and dependence factors? So now I've got two new sheets. Genetics of use, genetics of use of substances, and another sheet is genetics of dependence on substances. And Marianne's given me some stuff regarding that information. And by the time I'm done with Marianne, I then note recent articles that she cited that I think should be followed up on. And so I'll go pull those articles. Probably by the time I've gone through, I'm making this up, 10-ish articles, not read any of them in depth, skimmed them all. And by the way, as I'm skimming them, I come up with something that Mary Ann says that I think is awesome and interesting, and I never thought of it before, but it has nothing to do with my talk. I'll make a little note to myself to follow up on that, but ain't no way I'm going off on that tangent now. It's tough enough to take the time to review the literature for the first-year medical students regarding genetics of alcohol and drug dependence. So now what happens is I end up with, I don't know, usually 15 sheets of paper. Some of them only have 1 or 2 things on them, but notice what I've done is everything regarding a topic from any of the papers I read goes on the topic paper, not on the author paper. It's on because I don't do author papers, I do by topics, because that's how I'm going to present the information. And then I come and I look, oh my Lord, the proportion of the variance of drug dependence explained by genes is, I got 3 pages here of notes from all the, and that's of course useless to me in an outline. So now what I do is I look through and say, okay, we'll take this one, which is too much. Now, how do I summarize the major points from these 12 papers that happen to be giving me information on 1 page so that I can get to the major points that I'm going to use? Okay? Focused literature review. This is different than when I'm, well, actually it's not different. It's if I am reviewing the literature on a particular method, let's say the timeline follow-back procedure that asks people to, in a very structured way, to give you how many, in this instance, standard drinks they've had on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, etc., and you go back months if you can. Well, if that's what my talk's on, methods are really important when I review the literature. But for most talks, even scientific talks, in the lead up to what your data are, the methods you don't have time to go into, and for medical students it would be a waste of time. So many of my notes don't have, most of my notes have little to do with methods. And I now take these various sheets I have, with the summary sheets for some, and I place them in order. And I say, if I were talking to, remember the medical students, if I were talking to medical students, first-year medical students, and I was to develop a lecture on this topic, what order do I think I would put these in? And from that, I discover that I have a sheet here that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. Goes away. And then I discover that I have another topic that, how did I not think of that? And I go back and I try and pull information on all of those. Then what I do is I take the information on each of the topics, and having noted where I got them from, because I may have to go back to the article, that's like Enoch et al. 2013. I know it came from her paper, and then I know she didn't come up with these data because it was Grant et al. 2007. That's what my little note said to me. So I know where to go if I'm confused about something that's there, or I need to study it in any more depth. And then, from that, I continue my review, going on to other papers, as I briefly mentioned, summarizing the information, placing them in order, filling in holes, deleting irrelevant topics. One more time, I say, who's the audience? And by now, I'm saying, there's a lot of material on these 12 different topic sheets. What do I think are my 4 essential points? I don't mean 4 is magic. It could be 3 essential points, could be 5. But there should be some limited number. And now I'm starting to get an idea of what of the lecture led up to my major points. Did I make my major points clearly? What of the lecture gets me out of my major points, so that I am now leaving the audience, like I did this morning, hopefully, with several of the major points, well, all of my major points, still in mind. When is enough enough? So when do I stop my literature review? The answer is at least twofold. Number 1, I have to deliver this lecture on a certain date, or I promised myself that I'm going to have at least a first draft of this paper done by thus and such a date. I stop reviewing the literature when I run out of time, unless I look and say, I'm in deep doo-doo here. There's some other things I really need to pull up, then I'll give myself a couple of more days. And the second way I stop is I look and I say, this is a point, epidemiology. It's tiny compared to, in this lecture on genetic and environmental influences in alcohol and drug dependence. The epidemiology is tiny. It's just like the hi, how are you? So I don't need to have much. And I may say to myself, sometime I'd like to go in more depth in the literature, but I got other important things to do. So you make your decision based on how much time you got, and trying to keep in mind, I've got only 4 basic points I can make, and it is for let's say, a first-year medical students. And that's how I make my decision. Without those 4 goals, or the fact that I have to develop 4 goals, and without my reminding myself 20 times who the audience is, I can't decide what's enough. I can't decide how long I should continue, how much more I should continue on the literature review. Now for me, I'll just take a second, and I'll show you what an outline looks like. And I'll give you some thoughts about what happens to me when I'm putting an outline together. There will be a limited number of Roman numerals. The Roman numerals are big division, Roman numeral 1. Guess what Roman numeral 1 will be? Introduction. And what will be the last point for a talk or for a paper? What will be the last point I'll make in the introduction? Here's what I will cover. So my introduction is just, it's Roman numeral 1. There'll be, let's say, a capital A and a capital B and a capital C. I'm making this up. And it's giving information, genetics. The epidemiology would probably be part of my introduction to say, students, this is important for you. Maybe the next part of my introduction would be, these are disorders people die from, and some information on that. And therefore you need to learn about the precursor factors, which would be another point, and then therefore this lecture will cover. That's what it is. Then Roman numeral, what will my last Roman numeral be? I don't know the number, but it's going to be conclusion. And as with a paper, tell them what you're talking about and why it's important. Tell them how you did it, which is not a big issue for most of these talks. Tell them what the results are, and then remind them what it was, why it was important and what you found. It sounds so boring. However, despite the fact that it's a formula, it's what works. And if you take a look at scientific papers, they almost all do what I'm just talking about. And so the outline, I know what my first topic is going to be, my introduction. I know the last one is going to be conclusions. I know, in all likelihood, there will be at least 4 other major divisions. They're my 4 basic points. And then I'll need a few points to lead up to it and a few points to take away from it. So I can't survive without an outline. Now I'm going to tell you about my outlines. They're very similar to my slides. My outline is got to be logical, and I've got to be able to skim it to see the logic. So all my outlines are fragments of sentences. You can do it any way you want. And by doing it as fragments of sentences, and I could show you an outline of this talk, nothing's more than 1 line. You can't see it well, but nothing's more than 1 line. And that's because if I hadn't given this talk or didn't feel very comfortable with this talk, I'd have this outline in front of me. And when I started to think of my laundry list, because my mouth is moving but my brain is way someplace else, and I've lost my place, or somebody goes into a coughing fit and I lose my place, then it's very easy for me to skim down a page and see exactly where I was. My outlines are not sentences. God help me, they're not paragraphs. They're the kinds of things that can very quickly be scanned, both when I'm trying to see where there's logic, whether the logic is correct, and also in case I lose my place. So that is indeed the discussion regarding preparation. And we talked about philosophy, most important, the 4 points. You're going to hear that 27 times. And a part of the philosophy is knowing your audience. Part of the philosophy is knowing that you all go off on little trips, and that I need to bring you back so that you get my 4 major points. That's the same thing in papers. And that basically preparation is everything. Preparation is knowing my material, organizing my material in a way that is going to be appropriate for the audience, and that's going to help them remember your major points. Now, part of preparation is slides. And so we're going to go into slides next. But before I do that, thinking about lectures, papers, grant applications, do you have any questions about what it is that I'm teaching that you will then hopefully learn something from? I hope it's useful. And then you'll modify for yourselves and do it differently than I do, but at least you'll have heard the major points. Any questions about this? Any instances you can think of and say, it's not going to work? Yes?
I have a question for you, and you may be getting to this. Beyond the content and your approach, in your manuscripts, do you have a certain format or in your grants? Specifically, I'm writing something right now and I'm getting hung up on what should I italicize, what should I bold? I'm trying to give them a lot in a very condensed version. I'm just wondering if you found a style that works.
Would you like me to comment? And the great question. So it's how does one take this material, because I keep saying this is how do you tell your story? It's not just lectures. How do you take this? And there are certain instances where you may have a bit of trouble applying this approach. And you gave me an option of talking about grants or paper. A paper is easier to deal with. So I have a paper I'm preparing right now. We'll probably go to the journal, the British, it's a British journal called The Diction. And it's a collaborative study being done between me and a group in Bristol, England. And we're giving data on the trajectory of maximum drinks every 2 years. It's measured every 2 years between ages of 15 and 19, a real important age period. When I start my paper, I know the audience, going to be almost all researchers, it's going to be international. So I got to be careful to not be too focused on the US. Then, when I start the paper, I start with the tables and figures. I never start writing till I have the tables and figures. And I'm looking at the tables and figures and putting them together in a way to ask myself, are these table and figures, are they giving information essential for my major points? And by the way, what are my major points? And I will turn next, and this will help a little perhaps, but you'll help me. You'll ask me if it doesn't. Then I'll turn next to, I just spent all this time studying these tables and figures. There were first too many. The second, there were too many statistics on some of them that weren't essential. A third, there were too many decimal points on ones that really weren't essential. Got all that cleared away. And now, as long as it's in my mind, I'll sit down and I'll write the results. Keeping in mind, how many words do they allow me? And I'll probably write my first draft too long, but at least try to be as concise as I can. After the results section, I know my major points. I know basically how I'm going to focus, what I'm going to focus on. I personally next go to doing my literature search, etc., for the introduction. And now I'm starting to get a feel for how long this paper is. And the paper that I'm writing probably is only 3 double-spaced pages for the introduction, because the introduction, there are certain points I have to make, but they're not terribly essential. They don't have to be in fantastic detail. Therefore, I will write my introduction. I know the first paragraph is going to say background on epidemiology or something about why people should pay attention. The other paragraphs are going to talk about what there is in this area and why they're deficient. And the last paragraph of the introduction is going to say, based on all of that, here's what I've done. I'm going to now explain to you what I've done. And so my introduction can't be written, and I can't decide what's important until I know what my basic message will be. Those come from the tables and figures. And that I remind myself who the audience is. And after the introduction, then the introduction says why it's important, what's wrong, and what I'm going to do. The results say what I did. I turn to the discussion. And in the discussion, all I have to do is reread the introduction, especially the last paragraph. And all I have to do is reread and remind myself the major points. And then I write my discussion focusing on those major points first, then talking about some other things that I might not have guessed from the introduction were going to be there, ancillary findings. Then I talk about what's inconsistent, and then I'll talk about the caveats, and I'm done. So for me, it's writing a paper, there's an art to writing clearly, and an art to writing in a way that doesn't bore people. But what's there is pretty straightforward. And of course, I'm at a stage where I've written a lot of papers, so I don't have usually troubles with my introduction of what I'm going to emphasize. The paper is as long as I've started with my tables, I'm okay. And if I don't start with my tables, I'm lost. And if I get to the introduction and I say to myself, I don't know which I'm going to emphasize here, I say, you've done something wrong. There's something wrong with your tables. You really don't have clearly in mind what your ideas are. Now, grants are a different issue, and because the people who fund it are the boss of me, and they're going to tell me how they want this done. But once again, now there'll be a lot more on methods, and my review of the literature is going to be mostly methods, as I'm reviewing the literature for a grant application. But I have to know my major points. I have, before I even start to write the grant, sometime early in writing the grant, I have to know my major points. And then I got to look up who's on that committee. And it's not that they're going to be the same people who are going to review my grant necessarily, but probably 80% of them will still be there. And it's the type of people they're having on that. And they're my audience. They're my only audience. And so I think that audience, with thinking ahead about what problems might be, part of a lecture and part of a paper, for that audience, what are they likely to object to? And within the space constraints I have, and I'll write my grant too long at first, but try to keep it as short as I can, what are they going to complain about? Those are the problems. And the things they're going to complain about that would be a shame for me if they missed, they go in bold. And I try to keep my boldings as short a phrase as possible because of how grant reviews go. 20 papers, 20 grant applications, probably not that many. And I'm busy right now, I'm a reviewer, and I've got a pile here of ain't no way. And I'm going to try and be as fair as I can, but I want to get what I can over there as quickly as I can. And then of the remainder, I'm going to have to read in more depth, but their first read through is that abstract and looking at your sentence, your chief sentences in every paragraph, if they're going to go into that kind of detail, and they're going to skim. And so that's why that bolding is important. Bolding is usually not important to me in a paper. The only time it becomes important is if I'm afraid the reader's going to get lost. And then I usually use italics, but it doesn't matter. But in grants, man, for me, and everyone's going to be different on this, for me on grants, the bolding and italicization is really important, but the bolding is remembering who's my audience, who they are, what they're looking for, what they might not like about this grant, and if I were in their shoes and skimming, what is it I would need to see? Okay, that helps a little, thanks. Good, lovely. Let's go on to slides. Slides are fun. I could give a lecture without slides, and sometimes do. So if I can do it without slides, what is the importance of slides? What are they trying to, what are they doing for me? I think we just went to sleep. There we go. What are they doing for me? They are helping me emphasize my major points, my 4 major points. They are focusing people's attention. So, I don't always do this, but I will often start a lecture with, what are the 4 slides I couldn't live without? They're my 4 major slides. And then I'll say, how am I going to build up to those 4 major points, and how am I going to bring the audience to rest from my major points? And then, for those of you who saw the lecture this morning, and if you've been paying attention to what I've been showing you today, there wasn't a slide I showed you. That wasn't something that, well, probably not anyway, that wasn't something that a 10th grader couldn't understand. Why? Not because my audience is a 10th grader, but if they can look at it and have it in 10 seconds, what it is I'm trying to say, they'll listen to me. if what I put up there takes them a minute and a half, by the time they're done reading the slide, I'm already on to my next topic. So it's got to stay, to me anyway, they have to stay simple, be understood within a very short period of time. And by simple, it means that they are on basically a really easy way to scan, puts them about 10th grade level, and that even when I'm showing data to a scientific audience, they're almost always cartoon-like data. They're real, they'll have standard deviations, but the standard deviations bars might go in one direction, not two. And there may be 4 groups there in the data I'm showing, but the first iteration of that slide is real simple, and then you add another on, and then you add another on, so that they can assimilate the information very, very quickly. Then the slides have large font. Do you have any trouble reading this? Of course you don't. And if you did, I'd give you my glasses. It's that large font so that people in the back can see it. Okay, I do have, Martin's right, he didn't say it, but I do have idiosyncrasies. I know it's, one of my idiosyncrasies is, I think I'm insulting people in the back of the room when I say, hey, you guys back there, I don't give a damn about you, you're not going to be able to read this. And people will give slides and they'll say, I know people in the back of the room are going to have trouble reading this, then why are you giving the slide? So, large font. That means this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. You'll hardly ever see a slide of mine of more than 8 lines. That's not an absolute, maybe there'll be a 9, but there's only so much you can get. Just like my outline, they're 1 line. Of course sometimes I can't do that. But you could skim down this slide really quickly because your eyes can take in a line of 4 or 5 words at a time easily and understand them. And am I important? I am totally unimportant. The audience is important. How do I make this simple for them? And as I mentioned briefly, and I tried to do that on this talk, all of the titles are totally capitalized. All of the lines have the first letter in each word capitalized, just to get used to it and it doesn't bother you that there's something potentially wrong with the slide. I try to limit myself to less than 1 slide per minute of my talk. Now, 20-minute talk, scientific audience, you might have a little trouble doing that. But if you go much beyond 1 slide per minute, it's very hard for the audience to follow. And they get into a lulling of slide to slide to slide, which takes their attention away from you. And it is, the best you can do to avoid it is important. Now, when I first did this slide, my stupid computer took everything I put down and scrunched it all up to here. And I can do better than that. I can then tell the computer to do every other to 1.5 or 2 spaces, or I can increase the font, or I can get rid of words. This one, don't use more than 1 slide per minute, becomes less than 1 slide per minute. So any words that are not essential, you get rid of. Because why? 10th grade level, look at it, understand it very quickly. And you just, the minimum, it was what Martin was talking about before, the fewer words that you have, the better it is to understand. Keep the text simple. God bless Susan Taper. Susan Taper, for this organization I mentioned, the Alcohol Medical Scholars Group, usually for the new scholars coming in, gives a lecture about PowerPoint. And have you ever seen this at a meeting? I sure have. And I get halfway through by the time the guy or woman is going on to the next slide. And it doesn't have to look like this. So you really have to keep the text simple. And really, I'd like $1 for every time I've seen this type of slide at a meeting. And it doesn't have to be that way. Then, animation. I love this. She is so wonderful. I just love she did this. Enough said, or not said, that I'm not very good at PowerPoint, so basically the only animation I use is what you've seen. It's because it's beyond my capabilities. I'll learn better someday. But it's animating points. And every now and then, there's a slide I'd love to have shown you that was just so effective regarding showing nystagmus. I'm going to try and remember if I ever give this talk again to bring that slide in, because it was very effective and not distracting. But you got to be careful. Don't do it just because you can. And that, remember who the audience is and don't distract them. Then, quotations were already covered. I never, it's totally wrong. I rarely use quotations. I'll give you an example of an exception. I was helping somebody who was doing a lecture on motivational interviewing. And in motivational interviewing, and the goal was, the audience were clinicians. For motivational interviewing, among clinicians, many of the clinicians don't know what to say. How do you elicit this? How do you respond to that? So he had to use quotes. But the quotes were one line long. There were 4 or 5 words. They were very short quotes of then what he said more about. So sometimes quotes have to be used, but usually they shouldn't. And tables and figures, come on, give me a break. That I can't read that. Nobody can read that. And the problem is, whoever did this, which was Susan Tapered, but she only did it for demonstration, whoever did this didn't stop and ask herself, what does this slide add that's essential to the major points I'm making or building up or coming off them? Obviously, 5.4 would have been perfect. And it's very likely, right, 5.4 rather than 5.419664. And that in all likelihood, all these lines weren't needed. She could have said, I'm going to now demonstrate regarding depressive symptoms on the Beck Depression Inventory among, as it relates to student drinking. And I'm going to basically show you an example of 1, who was a non-drinker, 2, who was a moderate drinker defined blah blah, and 3, who was a heavy drinker. Probably there would have been 3 lines here that were needed, and even that should have been rounded off. So it's as much the things that you should avoid as the things that you should do. I'll just very quickly, and then we're going to be ending, I just very quickly want to share with you several types of slides. And the first type of slide that we're going to look at are transition and setting mood slides. This is a slide I often use. I'm going to be talking, these are all my daughter's artwork, and I'm going to be talking about the effects of alcohol on brain neurochemistry, or benzodiazepines on brain neurochemistry. And to illustrate that, I give you a rest so that you can kind of look at that and think about your laundry list. I'm talking about our brains are basically chemicals. The brains, the medications are basically chemicals, and of course, that's how they affect and change our mood or give us psychotic symptoms. Here's one that's a transition. This is just lovely. It's the collaborative study on the genetics of alcoholism, which is about alcoholism and genetics. And so it's no meaning there. It's just, isn't it pretty? And then let's move on to, I'll now be giving you data from the collaborative study on genetics of alcoholism. This I had to throw in. It's the Alcohol Medical Scholars. Pay no attention to it, but it's what I will often use when I'm introducing that group if I'm lecturing about them. And then simplified data, probably the most important thing for you. There are so much data on this slide, yet how simple it is to understand because it's a cartoon. So what you know is you got your green guys and you got your yellow guys. I explained to you, and if the slide was appropriate, I'd have written it out, that the green guys have a family history of alcoholism and the yellow guys don't. Then I tell you that these two groups had identical blood alcohol levels, and I tell you that they all consumed their alcohol within 8 minutes at the beginning. And then their blood alcohol level and the effect of alcohol was measured over time. And I use such things as prolactin changes with alcohol, the EEG changes with alcohol, subjective feelings of alcohol. And while not all results will always be the same, it will 9 out of 10 to 99 out of 100 times turn out that the group at high risk for alcoholism is showing a lower effect at the same blood alcohol level. But you could hear me say that. It's just so obvious from here. And it is not the standard deviations. It is not many details in here. I'm not giving you a series of 5 slides with different effects. I'm just summarizing what the data are. And that this is also a very simple, incredibly complex slide. A lot of work went into it. I don't mean to the slide, but I mean to the data. That indeed, the variance of risk for alcohol dependence is, who wouldn't be able to see this? Genes and environment. They're about equal, but genes are probably a little bit more important. And that what's inherited here are multiple characteristics like alcohol metabolizing enzyme, sensitivity to alcohol and others, and each of them has multiple genes. Very simple. You could hear me say that because I didn't make the slide too difficult. And then real difficult data, let's go to where this goes. That can't be understood. And this is a model of how family history contributes to alcoholism in some families through a low level of response to alcohol. And that there are a bunch of mediators here of how it operates, with about half of it going straight and about half of it going indirectly through the mediators, which is how we put a prevention program together. Identify people with low responses early in their drinking career, and then try to change these mediators, because you sure as heck aren't going to be changing their genes. So I start and say, family history of alcoholism is related to alcoholism. That relates to bad alcohol outcomes. Family history, a level of response is also related to these mediators, and I say what they are, and that the real story is that they all relate to each other, and half of the, etc. Simple. I could have put in beta weights here, but not for most audiences, not unless I was talking about somebody who was doing what these are structural equation models. So I'm going to now jump out of slides, and I'm going to talk about delivery, and then we will end. By now you've learned that the least important part of telling your story is actually getting up and giving a lecture. Your preparation, your philosophy, your major points, your slides, all were built up before you deliver the lecture. So there are a few small things that I can tell you about delivery of the lecture. Come in before the group and inspect the room. I came 15 minutes early. It's not that I had a lot of time today. It's in my own best interest to have come 15 minutes early, so that some people here helped me to make sure I had my slides lined up. If it's a new auditorium, I feel less anxious when I've seen the place and feel comfortable in the place. So inspect the room beforehand. Second, stand. I would move here, I use the pointer, I would move back here, I would lean over toward you. That movement all caught your eyes. And standing, whether you move or not, of course going like this doesn't help, but whether you move or not, that standing really helps focus people's attention, which helps you to tell your story. Use an outline. I have my outline. The outline was in the format that I said for you, and I was able to do it by using my slide copy, but the slide copy was pretty much helping me with the outline. State your goals at the beginning. I did that for you today, and I did it this morning. I told you what we're going to be talking about and why. Then, announce transitions. I use slides to announce transitions. It is, now I've finished preparation. Let's move on to another aspect of preparation, slides. You're all with me again. And that stating transitions and summarizing at the end of each major section really helps. Summarizing along the way. Eye contact. Why did I skip slides? A, I was watching the time, which is very important. But B, I could tell, because you're normal people, that I was starting to lose attention. When I see I'm losing attention in the audience, I change tack if I can, or I skip over things that aren't really necessary, and the additional slides were certainly not necessary. But eye contact is all that did it. And first time you deliver a lecture on a particular topic and you're really nervous, you might not be able to revise too much. But once you get comfortable with that lecture, and the more comfortable you are, the more you will be able to revise. There is a law of physics. I've never really understood it. It's really very similar to, it's always warmer walking uphill than walking down, which is another I don't really understand. Of course it is. Of course you're exerting yourself on the way up. It is, I do not understand why I cannot keep track of the time unless I have a clock. I know what time I began. I know what time I'm supposed to end. And help poor Martin if he's the guy who's supposed to give the next lecture and I've taken 10 minutes of his time. And then I start feeling really nervous and guilty. So I watch the clock. And then of course at the very end I summarize the points. So we pretty much covered what I needed to cover today, which was that giving a lecture, telling your story through papers, telling your story through grants, there's a mechanism to do it. There's a way to do it optimally. My way, it focuses on major points, knowing the audience, and presenting material in a clear way so that, in an outline format basically, people in the audience can follow you. The specifics of my movements or how I tell jokes along the way, they'll work for you, they won't work for you. They're really not very important. But the basic structure is hopefully something I was able to share with you. So I'd be interested to see whether you guys have any questions. I don't know, we're about a couple of minutes over. But do we have a few minutes for questions? Sure. Any questions about anything you'd like? It be business. That's delivering the information, the story, and it's business you learn how to do. But yes, thank you.
I have a question about questions. About questions.
Okay, sure.
And in terms of keeping wanting in at a reasonable time, and letting people answer questions during the talk.
Right.
How do you handle you ever getting too many questions and you find yourself getting behind?
Okay, super. A couple of quick things which were on the slide, which is restate the questions, which I didn't do for you here, but I did mostly, so that sure everyone heard it. And by the way, restating the question gets it framed in the way I want. And if the person was really far off and you don't want to embarrass them, then it helps them to feel better because you reframed it in a way that works. Never get angry because you turn the audience against you. If somebody's mean to you, which doesn't usually happen in a lecture, if someone is mean to you, the audience hates them. And just leave it that way. Just be really nice. And you'll lose that support from them if you get angry. This morning I had a rambling question. A guy who really had no question to ask that was related to my talk. He was, I don't want to embarrass him, he's not here, but he, a very smart guy, he had things that he wanted to talk about. They had nothing much to do with what I wanted to talk about or what the lecture was about. And I'm watching the people in the audience. They're picking their nose, they're filing their nails, and he's really boring with this long preamble. They're the worst things to handle because I don't want to embarrass him. He's really a nice guy, I'm sure, and he seems to be really smart. So how do I help frame him? And I often say, that's really very interesting. I'd like to talk to you about it later. We'll get to limiting the number in a sec. Or I say, that's very interesting. I'm sorry we're a little short on time. What's the specific question you'd like me to address? I have to be careful how I say that. But I certainly don't want to insult him. That's the toughest. The rambling questions are the toughest. The other thing is, of course, when somebody asks me a question, I don't know everything. I don't even know everything about things that I think I know a lot about. And when they ask me something I don't know, I say, I don't know. Here's my guess, and if you give me your email address, I'll send you the information later. And I do try to follow through. When there are too many questions, what I basically say is, isn't that wonderful? That I hope that means that this topic is indeed of great interest to everybody, but I really worry about this room has to be used again soon, and so I tell you what, after this lecture, I will be out in the hallway, and I'll be really happy to answer any questions. And if that's not good enough, or that doesn't work well for you, here's my email address. And I'm doing that, but I'm watching the time. So thank you. Questions? Yes?
Is there anything important to select the background versus nature
thank you.
in the slide?
The question is specifics about the slides. There are certain things that don't work color-wise. Red doesn't work, and some forms of green, they vibrate, and they bleed. They're hard to read, and you can't spot it on your computer. Looks just perfectly fine on your computer. You can only spot it after you've projected it someplace. So I almost never use reds. I almost never use bright greens. I'm a meat and potato guy. A blue background with white or this kind of greenish works okay. That's actually, to me, it's a yellow. The blue background with white or yellow writing is really very good. It also goes well with a black background, although I find a black background just a little bit disturbing. I just, like something bad's going to happen to me. But they do work really very well. I don't use shading I don't use, there's sometimes you can shade the specific letters, or you can do shading where half or a quarter of the slide is a little bit more difficult to read because things are changing shades. I just stick to this. And almost all my lectures are, almost all my slides are these colors.
Not
So-
the opposite, the white background.
White background's fine with black lettering, I'm so sorry. You're right, white or blue lettering should work just fine. But I try not to get fancy. Usually by the time I'm doing my slides, I've already invested enough in the lecture that I'm saying, oh my God, I got other things to do in life. And I just stick to what I know. Okay, thanks. Other questions? Yes?
Do you include references on your slides? For saying
Great question. Do I include references on my slides? They're distracting. So I can, but I must have them if I've taken somebody else's slide directly from them. Tabrick was down on those slides because I took them from her, and it was just a nice thing to do. If I take I never take anything that I can think of from a book chapter or from a paper, so I don't have to worry about that. I'll cartoon them, and I don't really have to have the reference there. I can say this is modified from thus and such, and can come out of my mouth. But one of the lectures these people on the alphabetical scholars were putting together was actually a picture that worked very well to demonstrate what she was doing, which was a cover from a book. And there she had to at least say Shaw 2010, whatever it happened to be, and then she can explain it better. But if you have too much small writing, which is what's usually needed, it's distracting. Sometimes I will have a slide at the end with some key references. So sometimes they're really needed. I prefer to avoid them because of my horror of distracting people. Other questions? Humor, you saw how I used it here? Because I like people, and because I have a mind that I must control, because it will go off on things like puns and stuff, but I can, as long as I'm doing it carefully, I can usually fit them in as a spontaneous humor within a lecture. Other people like some cartoons. I don't. There's nothing wrong with them, as long as the writing of the cartoon is large enough so it's obvious for people in the back of the room to see. It's just a matter of taste. Martin, can you think of anything else?
All I could think of, no.
No.
But, one of the things that, so when you give a talk, it is sort of like listening to Johann Sebastian Bach. It's like this very, now some other people, it's more like the Romantics or something.
Yes.
And you know, so some of the suggestions for the more say the TED Talks,
Yes,
is to also work closely with when you don't say something, when you pause. So have you worked with that?
I believe I could work with that. Then I know what the goal is, who the audience is, and I've only got 10 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever they are. I think I could take, I haven't done it, so I could be totally wrong, but I think I could take anything that I've given and modify it into a TED Talk. But in a TED Talk, I would imagine I can only make 2 major points in 10 minutes. And I could do that, or a TED Talk which makes 1 major point. And it is only a matter, of knowing the audience and knowing your major points. And in this instance, for a TED Talk, these brief talks to bright people, and these TED Talks, as I would understand them, I would have to go from what was 4 major points to 1, or 4 major points to 2. You just adjust it to the audience. I hope I could. I hope someday I will do something. Yes?
How do you handle then, let's say the person before you at a scientific presentation took too much time?
Yes.
And now you're left with half the time than you had originally planned and made slides for.
Absolutely. So, how do I handle it if the person performed, or there was a fire drill, something happened, and I have a 20-minute talk left, time-wise, when I had a 40-minute that I was given to begin with. I go to my 4 major points. I start off by saying to the audience, as things turned out, I never blame anybody, as things turned out, we don't quite have the amount of time that I'd like. So as I present this material, I'll be skipping over some slides. if I had warning, by the way, I would have hidden those slides. But here I am standing there, and I didn't know till the last minute. And then I'm in my head, from the outline or the slide copy, I'm going through what are my 4 major points. And then as in a mantra in the back of my mind, as I'm going through the lecture, I try to figure out how do I, quickly as I can, get to the 4 major points and get out. And if it's cut to 10 minutes, maybe I can only cover 2 major points. That's the purpose of the exercise I give the alcohol medical scholars. I only do it if they've delivered a decent lecture, meaning I don't want to embarrass anybody. But if they've delivered a decent lecture, I'll then say, and tomorrow, or sometimes I just do it on the morning, and say, taking no more than a half hour, promise me you won't. I want you to show me how you could have given this same lecture in half the time. Often what I'll do is I'll put up the slide sorter, and actually it's an exercise we regularly go through. I put up the slide sorter, and so for the audience, there's 10 people there. And for the audience, and I say, okay group, of all those slides, he's giving a 40-minute lecture, he had 35 slides, would you please show me the one slide he couldn't have lived without and still been effective? And then show me the next slide, and the next slide. Do we have time, if we're going to really cut this down to no more than 10 slides over a 10-minute lecture, do we have other points that we couldn't live without? Then we pick those, we pull them out, and they hide everything else, or however we're doing it. We pull them out to a separate lecture, and then we go back to the slide sorter and say, and which of these slides now, 1 or 2 slides, does he absolutely need to get to the 3 major points that he has remaining? And then what slide, if any, does he need to get out? And the groups can almost always do it. The hardest is if you have to do it spontaneously. And at least here, it could have been this guy was notified an hour ahead of time that he was going to have only half the time. What would he do? For me, and as you give more lectures, many of you will be able to do this. For me, if it's a good day, if I'm not whatever, crazy or tired, if it's a good day, that's what I'm doing in my head. Is I'm trying to figure out what are my slides that are key and how do I get to them. And if I've only got 20 minutes, heaven help me, it's going to be, unless there's some real exception, it's going to be less than 20 slides. Right. But at least I know how I'm going to approach it. Mm-hmm. The worst thing I could do is try to show everything and talk fast. Then the whole time's wasted. Nobody will get my points. Okay? But that's a challenge. Time ahead of time to teach you how to do it. Could sit down with you, would take no time at all for you to show you how to cut back from a major 40-minute lecture to a 10-minute lecture. No time, it wouldn't be any trouble. But spontaneously, that's a little difficult.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Okay. Thank you guys. Thank you for having me, Mark.